Hi guys. We'll give everybody a second to get settled here, because the next section is going to be terribly, awfully boring. You know why it's going to be boring? Because what could be more boring than talking about forms? Those terrible little things that force people to type things inside of boxes so all of you can make money. I personally find forms fascinating, so much so that I wrote an entire book about web form design, trying to get people to complete forms quickly and easily. But forms are one of those things that everybody dislikes, while at the same time they sit at this pivotal point of conversion. You want somebody to register? What's in between them becoming a customer? A form. You want somebody to buy something? What's standing between them giving you money and them getting the product they want? A form. Right? And you just go down the list of all the most important things on the internet, and what you find is a form is usually the broker for the stuff that matters. So while these things can be nuanced and painful, I believe inputs and actions are critical, because they're literally, how do people get things done? How do they buy something? How do they become a paying customer? How do they accomplish whatever task you have ahead of them? So since there was a bunch of questions around form-based things, I'll actually jump into this. And we'll probably spend a good chunk of this time talking about these kinds of input opportunities. At the very end, I will also answer the most popular question that came up in the app, which was, should I do a responsive thing or should I do something different? Fair? So we'll save a couple minutes to make sure that most asked question actually gets a reply. All right. So with that, let's jump into it. Again, speaking of this idea of design considerations, things to think about while we're trying to design. And another thing to think through while going through the input process is the idea of minimizing typing mistakes. So what I'm going to do with the form stuff is I'm going to just keep stacking things for you. So ultimately you have a really big tool belt on how to build forms. So bear with me, the first few things may be small little detailed things, but you'll start to see how they build on top of each other until you guys are form masters. So a funny thing happens when you go and try to find design advice about forms for mobile. What you find is that designers actually agree on something, which never happens. But what they agree on is that filling out forms on mobile is hard, so limit it. Don't do it. It's too tough. People can't do it very well. It's not going to work. And all of you that have conversion problems in terms of checkout and the like on mobile probably feel this pain. But what are we getting at here? Have you ever encountered this thing before? Email, re-enter email, password, re-enter password. You guys have seen this. Why are people asking for this? Why are we telling people to repeat their email? Anybody? What? So they can get back. Yeah, because they can't type. You people are stupid. You're going to have spelling errors in here. And it's true, when you do collect email addresses, about 15% of them will be what we call hard bounces. I mean, they're not good emails. And if 15% of the people signing up or buying something, you can't talk to them, that's not good, right? So how do we get around this issue? Well, first thing I'm going to do is actually remove this inline help text. And we could spend some time talking about why we should do this. But I'm just going to show one image that I think makes a pretty good point. Email. This is what an email address is. Who does not know that at this point? Password, password. So we're going to remove that help text inside of this input field for a second. There's other reasons, but we don't necessarily have too much time to go into depth on that. So somebody types in an email address, and let's say they type luke@gmail.com. This little thing right here, watch how this happens. Luke@gmail.com. Did you mean luke@gmail.com? And if I tap that, it autocorrects. Doing this little bit of inline validation, this real-time feedback at the point people are filling in the form, will actually reduce those hard bounces by about 50%. So you'll actually have a real impact using this one little technique. And inline validation is an example of a technique that you can use to minimize errors. We learned this lesson at Yahoo. We had a registration form. And you'll see as I go through this registration form, notice it says, okay, that's good. You were able to type a name. You were able to select a gender. And then when it comes to birthday, I always lie on these things. I don't know why they need my actual birthday. So I'm going to do May 24th and, I don't know, 2020 or something like that. And I kind of But did you see how that actually worked? Right there, I change it and I enter something, and then when we get postal code, we can tell you that that's okay, and we make some auto suggestions. So we're doing a lot of this inline real-time feedback to help people get through this process and complete it more effectively. When we do this at Yahoo, error rates dropped 80-something%. It was just out of control. And when we did regular testing on this, we kind of compared an example of a form that does inline validation to a form that does not, and all the good things you want to have happen happened. Errors go down, completion times go down, satisfaction goes up. Now you may say, okay, well, I'm trying to build for lots of different devices. That was a nice little desktop example. But it turns out you can actually make this work in a multi-device way as well, all the way from your phones on up to your giant screens. So here where we have a small screen UI, here we flash an inline validation message, which just changes its location as you have more screen space. And then it can kind of come back down. So when we move on to the next field. And by the way, you'll note the help text here. It says not what an email address looks like, but it says we don't spam. Something you would actually want to know when you're providing an email address. Full name. Why do you want my name? So people can find you. Password, 6 characters. So we can actually use that inline text in more effective ways. Now here's some other ways of making sure we get a valid email address, because valid emails are important. So once again, I'm going to do luke@gmail.com, and I'm going to hit that continue button, and then pops up this. We auto-corrected it for you. Anybody see an issue there? Maybe what we should do instead, oh, I love that transition. Sorry, I have to do that again. That was fun. Okay, so I do right, and then I hit this. Okay, now wait for it. Boing. That's just awesome. I'm sorry. So we do luke@gmail.com, and this time when we hit continue, what happens instead is we can do something like this. And what's going on here is this idea that where there's output, there should be input. So rather than that previous scenario where we sort of displayed it out to you, but gave you no opportunity to correct things, here we can display it out to you, and you can immediately go make a change if you need to and move on. Now this is an example of a very important field. There's certain fields in our forms that are way more important than others. And I'll talk about another example a little bit later. But in some cases, we might want to get aggressive about how we ensure those fields are filled in correctly. Email is a really big one. If you do any kind of marketing, you probably want an email address, right? Depends on the market, but usually you do. And you may say, Luke, well, why not do this kind of autocomplete down? So when you type the G, we just sort of autocomplete it down this way, and you can sort of see the reason why not already. Vertical space is not necessarily our friend in these cases. So we have this tool, inline validation, something you can use to minimize typing mistakes. Another friend of ours when we do input is this idea of an input type. Now what an input type will do is if I set this input type to email, watch what happens to the virtual keyboard. It changes to include an @ and a dot, and the space gets smaller. So if I set an input type of email, I now have a much easier path to entering the right kind of input. And I can do all kinds of good things here. I can set the type, I can turn off auto-capitalize, I can turn off auto-correct. Because what are the chances that a dictionary has my email address in it? Probably slim. So auto-capitalize and auto-correct are input attributes that we can tune. And there's lots of places you want to do this that you probably are not doing this. There's many places you want to just throw in a little auto-capitalize off, auto-correct off. Here's a great example. If you do anything in the travel industry, do you really need auto-correct for this? SFO. Are you talking about Scott? No, my friend Scott is not an airport. This is the next one's my favorite. Let me see if I have that one in here. I hope I have this one in here. Oh yeah. Look, if my computer can do CAPTCHA for me, I am all for it, but highly unlikely that's actually possible. So I'm just going to turn autocorrect off there. And so you have lots, and this is a small thing. You may say, oh, what difference does it make? It really starts to add up. Set an input type, set input attributes, use inline validation. And these attributes can go even deeper. So for auto-capitalize, for example, what you can do is auto-capitalize word, auto-capitalize characters, auto-capitalize sentences. And you're not just limited to things like email for inputs. We've got all kinds of input types. We've got numbers, we've got dial pads, we've got, here's kind of the Android side of the coin. We have default, phone, email, URL. There's all kinds of customized input types that can help. And even in HTML, so not even talking about iOS, not even talking about the native platforms, inside of HTML we have number, we have email, we have URL, we have date, we have range. We have a whole variety of input types that help people put information in. So inline validation, input types, input attributes. Another tool to help minimize typing mistakes, input masks. So let's look at the phone number, and let's apply the stuff we already know. We want to set input type of tel, because when we set input type of tel, what we're going to get is a nice big numeric dial pad. And as I showed earlier, here's how it would look on iOS. Here's how it looks on weird versions of Android, like Amazon Silk browser. It's pretty universal. So we have this nice dial pad up with numeric inputs. The other thing we want to do is enforce a specific format. Right? We want to kind of lock people in. So a phone number, all we want to collect is numbers. A US phone number, which is the example I'm going to use here, has a specific format. So we set it up like this, and as you enter these numbers, watch what happens. It's just going to keep that format in place for you. If you enter anything other than a number, it will just ignore it. So what we're doing here is really minimizing the opportunity for people to make a mistake. The format is visible. It doesn't accept anything other than valid input, so it makes it really, really hard to screw up. But deal with different formats. That's a US. Yep, this is a US phone number. I'll show you a couple other examples of how to use input masks. You may use input mask for things like specific domains. So Apple does this on me.com, and the input mask here is this appendage to an email address. So the @me.com always stays there. And if you hit an @ or anything like that, we just ignore it and move you on. Twitter uses it for their login screens as well. The input mask puts an @ in the front, which is how you log in to Twitter. Now, depending on the format you have, there's a couple things to keep in mind when doing input masks. Okay, everybody see this? Ready? Is that what you expected? Let me do it again. This is kind of like, as you go, it reveals things. What I call the gradual reveal. Sort of like trying to answer a test question while having somebody grade it while you're answering it. It's very unnerving. So gradually revealing this input mask, not good. And it also doesn't set the correct expectations. What it promised us up front is not the format that we got to in the end, is it? Another issue with this technique is it kind of looks like something's filled in already. So instead what we can do, in this case we're going to collect a tax ID which has a specific format. And to your question earlier, we can support lots of different kinds of formats depending on what question we're asking. So here again we're collecting numbers, but as you can see it looks like something to enter and the format remains consistent throughout. So that format stays and it doesn't look like an answer. So yet another technique, inline validation, input types, input attributes, input masks. Now we got 4 things going for us. And believe it or not, you're probably all familiar with the input mask. Because if you've ever entered a password into a screen, you've seen the password mask. The password mask looks something like this. So you enter a character, and then as soon as you look up from the keyboard, they change it to a dot so you can't possibly see what you typed. You're all familiar with this, right? And the dots for the password, to me, is one of these patterns that comes from 30 years of PCs being stuck in our heads. It just does not work well. It doesn't work well on a desktop, period. It actually leads to lost money pretty clearly. If anybody has something in their shopping cart and they go through a password recovery flow, 3/4 of them will not make it through to completion as soon as they enter that password recovery flow. You can very clearly tie password recovery to lost dollars across the board. Much harder to explicitly tie it to increased security. Because what generally happens is somebody hacks your database, or right? You guys seen this? They're going to breach you some other way. It's not going to be through the dots on your freaking input field. Sorry, it's not. So mobile sites, this is box.com, which provides enterprise software. They actually have a field on their mobile login screen that allows you to show your password so you can see what you're typing. Now, personally, I think we should switch this to hide password. And the reason why I say we should switch this to hide password is if there is a mysterious stranger behind you with a handlebar mustache and trench coat. Here's what you do. Ready? You just kind of move the phone. The other thing, which is totally mind-boggling in my opinion, let me actually show you how this works. So when you are using one of these keyboards, watch what happens when I type it. The letter gets huge. You can see what I'm typing, whether or not there's dots. So this is a paradigm that really doesn't make sense in the mobile world. And despite this, I still think people have this aversion to what's happening here. So when we launched our app about 2 years ago or so, I decided to err on the side of usability versus this pseudo security. And so what we did was we put together a login screen that would show you your password by default and allow you to hide it if you were in a situation where you were nervous about somebody seeing it. And despite feeling this was the right thing to do from both an engagement and usability perspective, I was still worried that people would skewer us online. Right? What are you guys? Bunch of idiots? Don't you know you need the dots to have a secure password? Where's the dots? So I was scared. But nonetheless, we published some stuff around this, and we started to get the word out. And what I found was the opposite. I found lots of people actually saying, we rolled it out. We had 0 negative feedback. Did it for Sprint. 20 million customers. No issues. Tested. Well measured. My friend Mike, who stayed on at Yahoo longer than I, eliminated the second input field, displayed the first password. Double-digit improvements, no security issues. And now, today, 2014, 2 years later, you'll actually see in Windows 8, there's a little eyeball icon on the input fields that are secure, where you can hold it down and see the password, and then let go. It's kind of getting there. LinkedIn has a password eyeball that you can tap. Tap. There you go, to see your password. Amazon has the ability for you to see your password, and then you can remove it. It goes away. Now, the Amazon thing has actually gone through an interesting transition, so kind of want to highlight this. Let me see if I have it in the slide. Yes, I do. So in Amazon's application, up front, they started out with can't see your password. All you get is the dots. Enter it in. Nothing but dots. Then they made a change that allowed you to show it, but you explicitly had to tap show to see the password. Then they rolled out a version that shows it by default and allows you to hide it. And I'm going to switch decks for half a second here because I want to show you the next one that they just rolled out. And frankly, it doesn't fit on this deck. Oops. Here we go. Oh, and does it fit on this deck either? Come on. Oh, poop. All right, I don't have a slide. I thought I did. The next version on iOS just uses Touch ID to log in to the app. So there's no password at all, which I think is really interesting. As you can start to see this evolution, right? You can start to see these things happening. And so what started as, oh, I don't know if anybody's going to do this, now you can actually go and look at a number of places where this is in use. And I recently added Twitter, and I recently added Facebook to that, or Twitter and Foursquare to that list as well. So why do you do this? Well, even when you do this in a not so great way, so like putting this little checkbox on the bottom here, you will significantly reduce failed logins, which is a really big deal. If you're doing anything in terms of merchandising, recommendations, personalization, and the like, you want to keep people in a logged-in state as much as possible. Literally, huge amounts of money are on the line from logged-in state versus not logged-in state. So you want to let people get logged in. And as I illustrated earlier, this is an example of one of those things we've just had forever that we haven't taken the time to rethink. Right? We haven't had the opportunity to step back and say, does this make any sense on mobile at all? I'd contend it necessarily doesn't. I personally am quite obsessed with the password thing going away, and it has been very interesting. Let's turn that guy away. Let's get this guy out of here too. It's been very interesting to start seeing more and more of this stuff happening, where now the way to get into a service is just to go, and you're done. Very big difference between the pain that we put on people before. So, minimize typing mistakes. Make use of inline validation, input types, input attributes, input masks, and for inputs that really, really matter. I talked about email as an example. I talked about password as an example. Let people verify it. Whether it's some of those dialogue solutions I showed you, whether it's actually allowing people to see their password and they're inputting it. Most input errors happen because people can't see what they typed. It's this tiny little text inside of an input field. So we can allow people to verify sensitive inputs. Now we've got a couple things working for us, right? We have a few of these techniques. And let's keep jumping into the next set of things. So the next thing to consider while designing the input side of the coin is this notion of condensing input controls. And what does that mean? Well, if you look at this application, open table, this is for booking restaurants, you see this thing here, this default. Get a table for 2 tonight at 8:30 p.m. Doesn't necessarily look very tappable. I think that's an issue. But if you tap it, you can collect all the information you need to book a reservation in one little control, in one picker menu. How many people, which day, what time, flip, 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 and you're done. This is an example of condensing inputs. And the reason why we condense inputs is once we get people into input mode, then we can collect multiple pieces of information from them instead of making them move between lots of different input fields. Instead of making them move from one field to the next field. And I'll show you how painful that is in a second. But I'm going to start introducing different kinds of input types. So this is a picker menu. And you have picker menus in iOS. They're named different things. So we have them in Android. We also have them in Windows Phone. The Windows Phone calls them list pickers, and then Windows Phone has picker boxes and picker box headers and picker box headers with checkboxes. And one of the things that's hard about cross-platform development is people name things differently. Right? They have like different variants of these input controls. And so a lot of the consistency across platforms when you develop across platforms is trying to find the right navigation controls and the right input controls for each platform. Now, picker menus can be moved into multiple picker menus. This is what I showed in the open table example. Here's what it looks like in iOS. Here's what it looks like in Android. Here's what it looks like in Windows Phone. So we've got a couple inputs bundled together. And there's web solutions for this as well. You can go and get like these front-end toolkits that give you these picker menus, but I would actually suggest you don't go do that thing. You don't go do that. And instead you use input types again. Because if you use an input type of month, you'll actually get a multi-picker menu. If you use an input type of date, you'll actually get a multi-picker menu. If you use an input type of time, you get the idea, right? You'll actually get an input menu. So this is an example of a condensed input, even date time, which is kind of a crazy one. But it keeps people in input mode. Once you tap once, now all of a sudden you can set a few things here and move on, instead of jumping between all the separate form elements, which is an important consideration. And this idea of condensing inputs doesn't just apply to these compound questions. It can apply to things like this. So instead of first name, middle initial, last name, we could do something like that. We'll talk about that in a second. That one tends to be a little controversial. But the idea is, again, stay on the keys, keep people in input mode. Here's a much less controversial one. 16 fields for collecting a phone number on a phone. Ready? This is one of my favorite transitions, too. I just took 16 fields and made them one. That's pretty awesome. And you say, oh, but I need an extension. Okay, great. Let's make an extension available if you're dealing with businesses and you really need it. But don't show it to everybody. Forms that hide controls from people until they're relevant are completed more quickly, have less errors, have higher satisfaction. So, oh, but we need another number. Okay, well, maybe we can introduce that like so. Now, another reason why we want to avoid splitting entries, there's a great series of studies in mobile commerce from the Baymard Institute, and they publish a bunch of stuff. And one of the explicit things they have for forms and checkout in particular is not splitting single input fields, because it turns out people find the division illogical, they have a hard time with it, and sometimes they're unclear on what's required. So let me show you the first one. First of all, you know somebody's starting from the desktop when they have this kind of control on a mobile phone, something that looks like a phone number field from the desktop. So here's a great example, and this is why this sucks on mobile. You're going in here, you switch over to the numbers, you type in the 3 numbers, and it auto-tabs you over so the keyboard goes away. So then you have to tap the field, you bring back the keyboard, then you have to shift over to numbers, then you type the next 3 numbers, and then it auto-tabs you over so the keyboard goes away. So then you have to go tap to the top, then you have to switch over to the number, then you have to tap the 3 things, and then you get the idea, right? You've just made the process of entering a phone number incredibly painful. Remember, input types, input attributes, input masks. We can cover all this stuff by condensing these input fields down to one. To go back to that controversial thing about name, if you've ever sat in a usability study where you try to collect somebody's name, very commonly you will see this happen. Anybody see this? People just start to type their whole name into the thing that says name, because that's my name. And they're like, oh, no, you want my first name separate from my last name. Go. This is an example of what people perceive as a single coherent entity. I have my name. Now, one of the reasons for separating out first name from last name that people give is like, oh, what about internationalization? Right? That's why we need separate fields for internationalization. Well, it turns out there's some places where people have one name. It turns out there's some places where people have 8 names. So if you actually want to be international, you want to support all that stuff and not make this hard break between you have a first name and you have a last name. That actually does not internationalize very well. And then the third reason people give why they don't collect full name is because, oh, we need to sort our tables by last name, which is like letting the database run your life. Right? At that point, you might as well just cede control over to the robots and go live in a Terminator-like landscape. Another reason why splitting input fields can be dangerous. So here we have a postal code, and in the US we have zip codes that are 9 digits, and we have an optional 4-digit code at the end. But when you look at this kind of compound input, it's not clear what's required. Do you just have to fill in this, or do you have to fill in both? And as soon as you start making people think, they start making mistakes and having issues. Now, in the interests of consolidating inputs, we can take an address form that looks like this and actually start to get a little clever. So we could, and this is a US example, but I'll talk to international examples in a second as well. In the US, if you enter a zip code, we can, from that zip code, collect city and state. So we can enter a zip code, and then we can get, usually it's just one, sometimes it's up to 3 different city and state combinations for that postal code. As I understand it, in Great Britain, I want to make sure I use my UK-ness correctly, you can actually get postal codes pretty easily like this, and they're a little bit more effective, actually, than they are in the US. In other countries like Brazil, you can get even deeper into the street address from collecting postal codes. And some places like New Zealand, until recently, had no postal codes. You just had like that fence over there. The point, though, is with this, we're again condensing inputs. We can cut down on 2 input fields. Personally, I wouldn't use a drop-down menu here, but we can talk about that a little bit later. Now, this may tempt you to be like, okay, awesome, why don't we just do this? Why don't we just shove everything into one address field? And here, we may be going a little bit too far, because likely, just as people start to enter their name into that first name field, they'll just enter their entire address in here and not get to that last field. Now, to be honest with you, for a long time, I was actually nervous about this approach. I was nervous about using a postal code to get a city and state. And I was nervous about this because I was using my honed designer instincts. Anybody a designer in the room? Okay, good. So the rest of you will become designers now. Let me give you your design education. If you see a form and there is a lot of text next to an input field, we call that a usability problem. If that text is red, we call that a big usability problem. If that text is red and bold, we call that a very big usability problem. Okay? So now let's use your newfound design education to find the usability problem. Do you see it? Let's look at it. After entering your zip code above, you must select, click to highlight your city-state combination from the display on the left. After the selection, what? So I saw stuff like this, which led me to think people are confused when they encounter this combined postal code things. But I don't want to let my desktop conventions bias me on mobile, right? I don't want to let all that old school thinking cloud my judgment. So we decided to run some tests on how to do this inside of checkout forms. And so we ran a test around a couple different checkout flows, and we tried Weber. So what Weber does is they get your name, they get your address, and then they ask for a zip code. And this is kind of curious how this works, because what you do here is you enter your zip code, nothing happens, and then you tap city and state, and then you have that one choice. What is this dark magic you see? We also checked out Home Depot, and Home Depot used that same thing. So they did, first name, last name, address, and then zip code. Enter a zip code to see city and state. And when you tapped zip code and entered that zip code, note they're using a nice input type with the dial pad here. And when you entered the zip code, it gave you that answer right away, San Jose, California. And you could toggle it. Here they had another field. So in San Jose, California, there's these 2 things that match that zip code, which is why I use their example. And then we compared it against 2 things that had a standard address checkout flow. So here on shipping address, we did first name, last name, city. And what happened when you picked state, you had to go through this. If you live in the United States and you are in Alabama, I believe this is the only good thing that happens to you. Which is, when you tap the state code, you just get to tap one time and you're done. All the rest of us have to flick that wheel, find our state, and tap multiple times. Now, of course, ThinkGeek must hate people in Alabama because it denied him that right. Anyhow, we tested these things. We tested these traditional checkout forms where you do the city, state separately and the zip code, so 3 fields. We looked at that on ThinkGeek. We looked at that on Macy's. And then we looked at the new design on Home Depot and on Weber. And the new design is we condense those inputs. we collect city and state from just a zip code. And what we found was some people preferred the old way of doing things, but the vast majority actually liked the new way. The old way, just to complete the address block, took about 18 seconds. And you may say, oh, look, what's 18 seconds? 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000, 4 1,000, 5 1,000, 6 1,000, 7 1,000, 8 1,000. Are you ready to kill me yet? I'm not even halfway through. And the new design, it actually only took 12 seconds, but hold that thought. People thought it was easier, people liked it more, and the Home Depot one actually only took 8 seconds. Because the other one was so weird, that Weber thing, that it totally brought down, or brought up that total time spent. So moving from 18 seconds down to about 8 seconds, that's a huge chunk of time. And again, by itself, you may say, oh, that's not such a big deal. Start to do this for all the questions you're asking in your forms, and all of a sudden you will have really big returns, right? Input masks, inline validation, input types, input attributes, and now condensing input fields. And you're starting to have a very powerful arsenal for your forms. And we will continue to use that arsenal. So now we've got all those things put together, and let's move on from addresses to credit cards, payment fields. So credit cards, usually you got to go pick the type of credit card you have, and then you have to fill in all this information. Well, using our friends' input types, input attributes, inline validation, and input masks, we can collect payment with just that. And with this, what we can do is set a type of number, which is actually not what we want because it'll give us all these weird character things. What we really want is input type tel, because that gives us this dial pad, but it's not a telephone, so we have to use this little pattern thing. Small detail. But we now have this numeric dial pad up, right? Big fat numbers for our French fry eating fingers, and we can just tap numbers. So when you tap numbers, how does this field work? Tap, 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 tap. We indicate the kind of credit card you have based on the pattern we recognize in the credit card number. We flip that icon. If that credit card number is valid, we're just going to slide it over using our friend the input mask. And now we'll collect month, month, year, which is again still numbers. Keep people on the keys. Now we'll flip that credit card icon to show you where the CVV code is, and we'll collect the CVV code, and ta-da, we can process a payment. So condensed input fields down to one thing. You're just sitting on the dial pad, entering your keys, and we can now charge you. We've reduced the number of inputs. We've kept you on the keys. And there's a really nice implementation of this in Square. So everybody asks, oh, will people understand this? We went and tested this on iOS and Android as it is implemented in Square, and we actually found it was very successful. But we also learned a couple things, so I'll share with you the things that we learned. So this is the web-based version. That was the native app version. So this is a web-based version built by Zachary Forrest, and you can see as you enter a credit card number, if you enter an invalid credit card number, we'll just sort of error you right there. You can't move on. So bad credit card, let's move on from there. Now you're entering something valid. We switch the credit card to show you it's a MasterCard. And if we detect this is actually a good credit card number, what we're going to do is slide it over. Now you're on to month, month. And you just stay on the keys, typing. Notice we're using an input mask for that. Now we show you where the CVV code is on the MasterCard. You enter that. And in this one, we wanted to get the zip code, which, depending on how you do payment processing, you may or may not need. And ta-da, it's all done. Right? We're using real-time feedback, and we're collecting a whole bunch of information in a single field. And all of this on the web works with tabbing. If you want to use it on the desktop, it's all accessible. You can tap on the different sections as well. So I mentioned when we tested this, we learned a few things. First thing we learned is people love this. This is the strength of input types. If you use the right input type for the right task, you are helping people. They're like, oh my God, these big fat numbers is awesome. I just have to push numbers. This is great. Love the numbers. When probed, they asked, how do I sometimes go back to change my credit card? What if I want to check my credit card number? What if, well, A, we already made sure it's valid because we got the error. But if they want to go back, we asked, well, how would you go back? Some said they would go and hit the back button, which we made work. And some of them said they would tap that credit card field or the number, which we made work, so they could go in and edit it. And then the thing that Square does, which is really frustrating for people, is they turn your credit card number into dots. And everybody hated the dots. Everybody said, why is it dots? Why can't I see what I entered in here? So don't use the dots. The dots kind of suck. Now, this is an interesting way of kind of pushing the envelope further. And I got to spend some time last week with the folks over at Holiday Extras, which is this booking site in the UK, and they showed me their flow. And what they did in their flow is once they have your total in here, they just do this. They say, give me an email, get the payment information. They're not using that pattern, but they're collecting 3 fields. And then after you pay them, then they get the rest of your booking, which is genius. Think about this for a second. Then you go fill in all the information that you want. Why is this genius? I think this is genius for one simple reason. It allows us to turn a credit card form into like 3 fields. Let me actually pull up the deck that I have on this, because why not? So you want to talk, mobile conversion, try to get people through this. What do we usually do when we ask people to buy something online? Let me see if I got this. Yes, I have this. I think this is an important point, so I'm going to belabor it, as the saying goes. Where is my thing? Yes, here we go. So, to buy something on the web or on the internet, I've got something in my cart. Tell us where you're gonna send it. I do not agree. Okay, continue. Payment. Pay how you're gonna pay. Enter on the information. Continue. Almost finished, bastards. Submit. Why is our conversion on mobile so low? It's not as good as it is on the desktop. Nobody wants to buy on mobile. You ever have these kinds of conversations? Compare that to this. Here's what you're going to buy. Give us your email address. We'll use input types for this. Tell us how you're going to pay. We can use that input type payment method. We're going to stay on the keys, condense input type to one thing. We'll hide controls until they're necessary, and then we'll just streamline this thing down to this. This is a 1, 2, 3 field checkout form. If you're selling something digitally, you're done. This is it. 3 fields. If you need something to ship to people, I say make them pay for it first and then ask them where they want to ship it afterwards. Now, granted, you got to get shipping costs out of the way first, but do that like on the view item page. Do that in search results. Do that before they ever get to the cart. Right? Do that before they ever hit the checkout button. So you've got a total up front. People want the total up front anyway. But if you're selling something that can be retrieved via an email, your checkout form can be 3 fields. And you can actually go further than that, because your checkout form can just be point your phone at a credit card. Done. Your checkout form can be touch your thumb on the button. Done. These are the ways that we start to move conversion. You may say, well, you know what? Does this really make an impact? Is it worth this effort? Right? That seems like a lot of work. Let me point you to Amazon Prime. 1-click buying, 2-day shipping, aka you tap once, you buy something. People that move from Amazon to Amazon Prime go from spending $400 a year to $900 a year. 20% of all US sales come from Amazon Prime members. So reducing barriers to entry is a really big deal in this regard. And I contend a lot of the little tips and tricks that I sort of walked you through here are what help you do that, right? We talked about input types, we talked about input attributes, we talked about input masks, we talked about inline validation, and now I gave you this additional thing, condensed input types. The idea there is that we want to keep people in that mode of input. We want to keep them on the keys. We don't want to go split things up, and there's some things to be aware of. We don't want to go too far and break existing conventions or autofill stuff. But you start to see how you can really push this further. And I love the example of checkout, because when most people go and approach the process of redesigning checkout, what do? Take your checkout form and make it fit onto the mobile screen. And then they get upset that it's not working. It's not built for that medium, right? I just showed you an example of how you can do checkout in 3 fields. Get aggressive around collecting that payment info first and then collect the additional information. Like it or not, by the way, the native operating systems are going to push you guys to this. In iOS 8, you've got Touch ID, you've got Scan Credit Card. They will make you do this whether you like it or not. Okay, one more thing on input. Is this helpful? Yes? I see some mild nods. Let's try that again. Is this helpful? Yes. Wow, that was awesome. That was the loudest I've heard you guys all day. All right, this next section is one of my favorite sections, and then I'll go answer your responsive web design question, I promise. And actually, I'll let you guys go, because believe it or not, we only have 30 minutes left. It's funny how time can go fast when you're hungover and talking about web forms. So the last design consideration I will leave you with, things to think about while designing, is this idea that drop-downs are the UI of last resort. And I showed you the pain of the state drop-down in the US, right? Pick your state. If you live in Alabama, it's fun. Everybody else, it's a 4-tap operation. Tap it, scroll to what you want, tap the one you want, tap done. And I have this design consideration because when you go look at a lot of forms, many people's first approach to solving the input question is throwing in a drop-down. Here on American Airlines, when I'm trying to book a flight, your departure date is 3 drop-down menus, 3 times 4 taps. Your return date is 3 drop-down menus. Passengers, drop-down menu. Cabin preference, drop-down menu. Country residence, drop-down menu, drop-down menu, drop-down menu. The drop-down menus are challenging because they're hard to navigate. You can only select things. You can't really edit, and you can't style them very well. To come back to what I showed you with the zip code thing, remember Home Depot was doing this. They gave us a little drop-down. What we could do, since there's only going to be at most 3 values here, is instead of using a drop-down, we can use what's called a stepper. Stepper just moves these things up, down with 1 tap, nice and touch-friendly. So a stepper will increase a value by a constant amount up, down, and make small adjustments. You can split it up and make an editable area in between. But to go back to the travel example, what I'm going to do now is walk through each of the chunks of this travel booking form and talk about the different ways to ask the questions, to expand our vocabulary. We have some general notions here around condensing inputs, but now let's look at the ways we can ask the questions. What kind of input controls do we have? And it turns out the stepper is actually really good in certain cases. So if you want to book a traveler, you just go, done. The most you could ever do here is 8. So most you would ever tap 7, and that is an extremely rare case. But for most people, you set it to 1, and they can go. Even if you set it to a family of 4, it's less effort than a drop-down menu. British Airways solves this problem differently. They use our friend, the multi-picker menu, because they're selecting adults, children, and infants, and you can pull all those things together. Once you start to use steppers, though, you can find them in all kinds of places. So here for number of guests, number of rooms. And again, I bring this up because many people's first default is drop-down menus. Drop down for guest, drop down for bed, drop down for bedroom, drop down for bathroom, drop down, drop down, drop down, drop down. When Airbnb builds this out for Android, instead, they use stepper controls that work much more effectively. Now, with all input controls, it's not just go use a stepper. You actually have to understand what you're doing with it. So in American Airlines' redesign of this form, they actually do have a stepper control. But I think there's a couple things off with it. And let me actually illustrate what's off with it by jumping over to this Add Seniors and Children thing. So let's tap that. And boom. Stepper City, baby. Now the problem here is it's not as clear anymore what to do here. A, the controls are kind of grayed out. B, they're separated from each other. Remember our consideration of obvious always wins? It's not nearly as obvious what to do here as it is there. Right? So just using a stepper, just like using a hamburger menu icon, needs a little bit of consideration. But in general, this is a nice control to have in your arsenal. Now let's look at the other question. So we looked at number of passengers. That's a pretty typical in a flight booking form. Another question typical in a flight booking form is class of travel. Turns out there's a couple different ways to ask this question. So let's tap that over here for a second. And here's a pop quiz for you. Find the text written by a lawyer. Business class and higher with business class and higher full far with star. This is another issue of drop-down menus. They actually have text limits, and they'll just truncate your stuff. So you can't make sense of it. So maybe instead of using a drop-down, we could do what British Airways does, which is they use an action sheet. In the Android world, it's a dialogue or a pop-up. And I don't know how this happens, but it turns out the lawyers don't write the interface copy of British Airways, even though they're part of the One World Alliance, because they use like human language for this stuff. But an action sheet is another way to ask this question. It's a set of choices. It's kind of a contextual series of actions that call up from the bottom. United Airlines covers this a different way. For selection of class of travel here, you can tap that row and go to a table view. In fact, United is like super table view happy. They even do number of passengers with the table. Everything's a table. So maybe that's not necessarily great. Hipmunk does class of travel with a segmented control, or a radio button group, as I showed before. Coach, business first. And it allows you to tap on this right here. So segmented control is closely related mutually exclusive choices. And I'm going to pause right here because I want to do a quick quiz question for you guys and articulate why are we doing this? What's the point of us walking through this? Okay. Let's book a flight on American Airlines. Someone please give me an adjective that comes to mind when you encounter this form. Painful. Messy. Awesome? Exhausting. Exhausting. Painful. Messy. Basically, this is going to suck, right? You see this, and what's the first thing you think? This is going to be terrible. Same thing, a flight booking form. Adjectives for this one? Simple. Quick. Clean. This is going to be easy. Note, they're actually asking the same questions. This one has 2 extra questions. So they have show results by, which they probably don't need, and they have country of residence and a giant start over button. But what? But you know. So what is the difference between these 2 forms? Why do you react to one and say, this is going to be painful, this is going to suck, this is going to be terrible, and the other one you're like, this is going to be quick, easy, clean, nice? Why are they different? The only difference is they're using different ways to ask the same questions. They're using inputs appropriate to the kind of question being asked. They're using a stepper control for number of people. They're using a segmented control for class of travel. This is why we're walking through this, right? Because big picture, all these little things together actually have a really big impact. So let me come back to this and keep drilling further. So we looked at the segmented control for class of travel, or the radio button group. And these are mutually exclusive, essentially acting like radio buttons. Other questions in this form, right? We talked about number of travelers. We talked about class of travel. What about dates? Here we're using 3 drop-down menus for dates. In the new American Airlines, they actually just use 2 fields for departure date and return date. And when you tap on one of those, you get this kind of like date widget. You guys are familiar with this, right? Sort of like very desktop-y, isn't it? Very desktop-y control. Google Flight Search on mobile uses a different control. They have a single field for dates, and when you tap it, you go to one big flickable scrolling area that spans multiple months, and you can set a start date and an end date and kind of get your whole range and do it all in one. It's really nice and flickable with your thumb. You can set these things. Contrast that to using a traditional date picker like Kayak does. So you go to the date thing, you have to move between the months. You guys know this drill, move to the month. So you're going to leave here, and then you have to go to the return field, and then you come back to the return field, and then you have to find the month. And what was the date I set before? I think it was over here, so I'll just come back on the 21st. And now I'm departing March 20th and returning February 21st. I believe this is the pilot program of Elon Musk's Hyperloop patent. But even outside of the error that I made, did you see how much more effort it was to use those 2 date controllers in that traditional date picker to select the range? Now, Kayak has shifted from there to a single date range picker, but they have this weird, like, it must look like a calendar mentality. United Airlines has also switched to a single gate calendar, but apparently there's just a gaping hole between months in their view. So I don't know why. But once again, the principle is the same. So this is realestate.com.au. Everything's a drop-down menu. Should it be? Should we be using a switch? Should we be using a slider? Should we be using segmented controls? There's a lot of ideas that we can explore here. A switch is 2 diametrically opposed choices. Yes, no, on, off. A slider we can use to make adjustments around a range of values. You put a track down, and then you stick a thumb on top of it, and you can put it wherever you want. Now, just because you have these different input types doesn't necessarily mean they're the thing you should always use. For example, on this hotel booking site, setting the number of guests with a slider? Is that right? Sliders are all over the place. They're in Android, they're in Windows Phone, they're on the web. On the web, you can actually do a lot with sliders. You can set them up to look however you want. But the meta point here is I've walked through a bunch of these different things, and I've done it kind of quickly because we don't have a ton of time. But steppers, switches, segmented controls, sliders, date pickers, dialogues, all of these things are opportunities for us to ask questions the appropriate way. What's the right way to ask a particular kind of question? Most people, when they go and make forms, they default to the text field and the drop-down menu. The drop-down menu is like this workhorse. It's always, oh yeah, this is a drop-down menu, this is a drop-down menu. And if you use as a design consideration, something you think about while designing, this idea of drop-down menus are the UI of last resort, then chances are you'll explore all these types of things before you ever go to the drop-down. Now, maybe it turns out the drop-down is actually the right thing for you. I don't know. But at least it's not the first thing you reach for right out the gates. Because in some cases, maybe we do need a traditional input. Like on eBay, when you're bidding on something and you want to bid $5.65 or something like that, then maybe we just need a text input. This is an app called Lutzi, and here, to do the same kind of bidding, all you can do is use a stepper or a slider. So I could kind of tap this, make it 26, or I could kind of slide that to make it 28. But you can't do very precise or big changes with a stepper and a slider here, like we were able to do on eBay. So I walked through these, and I've been showing these examples inside of this travel booking form. And so one of the things that we did was we actually went and ran some research on a bunch of different travel booking forms. And by the way, I'll give you guys these slides. All of these studies are referenced in links down at the bottom. So if you want to dig into them, you can go grab them and get more insights. I'm walking through them at a relatively high level. But we looked at a bunch of travel forms, and we tried to understand. We looked at specifically six or eight different travel booking experiences on mobile, all of which use different kinds of controls for different kinds of questions. And we looked at which controls were best suited for which questions. And what we found across all these, that when it came time to pick travel dates, a single calendar worked much better than two calendars. So this select your travel dates, single input control with one panel to pick between them. That was a good way to ask the when are you traveling question. When it came time to pick the number of passengers, the stepper came out on top. So it was a very quick and easy way for people to select how many folks they're booking a trip for. When it came to class of service, we found people liked the action sheet approach when there was many options, but they kind of more liked that all the stuff was in one place, and the segmented control was an easy way to trigger that. So it turns out there was two controls that actually worked good for a class of travel. And again, I'll just sort of return to this example because I really think this hammers the point home in a big way. For me, the fundamental difference between these two things is, yes, there's one or two less questions being asked over here than over here. Like we're not asking for country of residence and show search results by. So there's one or two things that we can eliminate. But again, knowing these different types of inputs is the thing that differentiates these input experiences. One more thing on drop-down menus, and then I'll leave this alone for a bit, which is, well, what about more complex stuff, right? Because flying in a tin can in the sky from one part of the world to another is too basic. What about complex stuff? I work on enterprise and corporate things and B2B things. Well, this list that I came up with before actually came from folks working on a complex app. It was their observations that drop-down menus did not work very well for their use cases, that they were hard to navigate. You couldn't edit. You could only select. They had no support for hierarchy. And so I want to sort of show the solution that they came to for moving away from drop-downs. So I say it's a complicated web app because it's this invoice booking system. And when you're creating these invoices, you can set when the invoices are due. And so they created this controller that they call a picker, which, again, remember my call out that picker is inconveniently named. But the way it works is if you tap it, what you actually get is an off-canvas menu that comes in from the side. And inside of that off-canvas menu, you can pick one of the smart defaults, or you can tap specific date. You thereby get a calendar. You can set that specific date, and it fills in on the form. Because it's an off-canvas menu, it actually works really great on mobile and on other screen sizes. So now you're starting to see a bunch of the things that we talked about today come together. We're using off-canvas menus. We're trying to move away from drop-downs. And we have stuff that's working across multiple screens. As another example in their form here, you can also adjust the units. So what kind of units are you invoicing people for? And if you tap pieces over here, you again get the off-canvas menu coming in from the side. You can pick one of the most common ones, or you can actually type in a search, kilowatt, and you can pick kilowatts per hour. Now it fills in that value. And the next time you hit that control, the list has been updated and your most recently used thing is visible at the top. So again, we now have our input side of the coin mapping to our layout side of the coin. And we have a number of our considerations at play here, right? Which is drop-downs are the UI of last resort, and think outside the display box. Two things coming together. So to wrap up on the input side of forms for a second here, we have a variety of ways to ask questions. Instead of starting with the drop-down, end up there. If you can't think of anything else, right, fall back to it. But there's a lot of controls that you can lean toward that can help you out. And I'll do one last thing on input, then open it up for some discussion on it, and then we'll do the responsive versus non-responsive stuff. But I would really like to call out this one because I think this is an ongoing challenge for people. Last thing about input. If there is a primary action, it should be obvious. Again, I'm looping back to the beginning, right? Obvious always wins. A primary action should always win. So please tell me what the primary action is on the screen. Set photo? Believe it or not, that's what everybody always says. This is a registration form. The primary call to action is next. Brutal, right? This is how somebody signs up for this service. And you can blame flat design for this, but you know what? If it's a primary action, make it big, button-like, bold. Let's switch over to Android. Find me the primary action here. Who knows what it is? Sign in? Which one? Which sign in? The one at the top? Someone said the one at the top? The like little bold one, right? That is your primary action. Find the primary action on this screen. You get the difference? And you may say, but look, these are the operating system guidelines for iOS and Android. Yes. Operating system guidelines are designed to create consistency between an entire operating system and all the apps that live in it. They are not designed for the specific contexts that matter to you. They can't be. Otherwise, they would be just this mishmash of 5,000 exceptions. They explicitly have to make sacrifices, decisions, for consistency's sake, because that's their entire purpose. Their entire purpose is to enforce consistency, right? And so when you have a critical action that matters to you, that matters to your bottom line, you probably want context to win out over consistency, as I showed in these examples. Now here's another example. What's the primary action in this calendar thing? Well, it's up here, that little done thing. And I would wager there's a good chunk of people that don't find it because their attention is drawn by the big My Calendar banner and all the stuff below it. And I know this because what % of people do you think believed they were not able to search eBay on Android? You guys all see search up there, right? There it is. 25% of the people that were given this application did not believe there was a search field. And so what they ended up doing is they hit browse and they went down this hierarchical, painful thing to find what they were looking for. And it sucked. So primary actions are a really big deal, and I won't continue to lecture you on that. What I will just say is make sure the thing that's the most important is also the most obvious. So to pull all this stuff together on forms, we talked about a lot of stuff. We talked about the idea of minimizing typing mistakes. I showed how input masks, input type, input attributes, inline validation can all help there. Whole series of tools. Talked about condensing inputs, how keeping people on the keys in an input mode can help. And then I showed you how to turn credit cards into one field using those techniques all together. Then we went on and talked about how there's all these different input controls that we can use to ask questions in the appropriate way. So when you take input controls and you take condensed inputs and you take types and inline validation, all this stuff together, I believe you have a great toolkit in front of you to optimize forms and conversion and the like. So I will pause there, and I've spewed a lot of form-based information at you guys. Anybody want to talk about it? Ask questions? I need to throw this at you. Ready? Oh, good catch.
I was just wondering, do you have a method for A/B testing mobile apps? Because it seems to be in its infancy at the moment, to get a good technique to kind of try out those ideas that you're discussing with big numbers.
Yeah, we've always used homegrown solutions. But as far as I know, there are a couple startups out there that are doing decent A/B testing frameworks for you. I know Twitter bought one of them recently. Crashlytics has a nice A/B testing framework, and there was one other one whose name I'm spacing. But we've always rolled our own. So I don't know.
Thanks.
Yep. Anyone else? Yep. Behind you, I guess. Toss it behind you, and then we'll try to toss it all the way over here.
There. How you doing? I'm wondering about 3D secure screens on mobile. We have a problem with it. So basically,
sorry, can you repeat that first part again?
Yeah, 3D secure screen. So it's basically, you'll have an iframe, and inside the iframe you'll have a bank form, which is confirming your card. You have a password. I think it's 12-digit password, something like that. But it's been loaded as an iframe, and it's a desktop screen. So have you ever encountered that?
That sounds terrible.
It is.
Stop doing that. Loading a desktop screen inside of an iframe on a mobile device sounds like it would cause significant issues.
It's awful.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a business decision.
What business are you in? The business of not converting anybody to anything?
It seems that way, wouldn't it?
That's what it sounds like. I wish I had a better answer, but honestly, like...
You've never encountered it before?
It sounds like a bad idea to me. I wouldn't do that. I wish I had more to say.
Fair enough.
Throw an Android to someone? Oh, yes.
Yeah. So with the combination of technologies like Apple Pay and Touch ID making an appearance, most notably this week on apps like Uber, will the requirement for registration forms and payment details soon be a thing of the past?
God, I hope so. But, you know, there's maybe 1 billion active iOS devices. There's more than that with Android. There's way more PCs. There's way more Macs. There's way more all kinds of things. So even if one platform creates a super streamlined, no registration required experience, chances are it won't be consistent across all platforms. So you'll have to have something anyway. And many companies may choose not to participate in that system because they want to hold on to the data. So I still think thinking it through is going to be important, even if on 1 or 2 of the major platforms you have a more streamlined solution available to you. Personally, the thing he's referencing is on Uber, which is this car-based service, you can use Apple Pay. You don't even need an account. You just sort of tap it, you pay for a car, and you get it, and there's no registration or anything. So signing up, paying, and using the service is one thumb tap, which, yeah, pretty amazing experience, but they sacrifice getting their hands on some data, which maybe they're willing to live with. Other people might not be. I saw a hand over here. Let's throw that Android head over to that man. There you go. Oh!
Thanks. Could you say a bit more about kind of sticking to the Android or the iOS guidelines versus creating a kind of a good experience across all the different types of devices? And kind of a seamless experience. How do you weigh that up?
Yeah, let me see if I can show you something real quick. Okay, I hope this works. I'm jumping between like 5 apps here. So, yes. Usually creating consistency between platforms. Like this is the situation that eBay was in. They've got an Android app, they've got an iOS app, and they have a mobile web thing, and they're all kind of like the same but different. and different teams build each one, and the experience is incoherent. But there's ways, I think, to actually make these things align more consistently. So, for example, between iOS and the web, you can still maintain the same kind of controls, just orient things differently. So the things that I think are different between platforms, I think I've got an example of pulling this to Android as well. Yeah, let's see if I can pull this up. So for a search screen between a native iOS app versus the web, what we've really done is move the menu at the top and use the convention of the web to put a logo at the top up there. When we move over to Android, you can see that the core search results and stuff are the same, but we're using the controls that are more like the action bar, Android and the like. So usually what the differences between all the platforms are around core navigation concepts and then around the different input types that you can use. And then everything else can relatively stay the same and be aligned with more like of a core brand strategy. I'm not this person who gets overly married to OS design guidelines because I feel honestly the stuff that's happening in that Android action bar, it's really overloaded. And so I would even be biased to do something, where's my, I hope I have a version like this. Yeah, that actually does that kind of thing and bends them a bit further than they need to go. But that's, you know, that's a customized thing. So you may or may not choose to do that. Bless you. Okay, so I apologize. I got 1 minute, 30 seconds. I promised I'd answer this web versus stuff. People want to know, should we do responsive web design? Should we not do responsive web design? This actually may be the wrong slide to show that. But I have a very simple answer to that, which is yes. And what I mean by that is, even if you're building something for the web that's only going to run on phones, like, what's a smartphone today? Is it 3.5 inches or is it 7 inches? Okay, what's a phablet? What's a tablet? Where do you draw the line? So even if you're building only a mobile-only site, you actually have a range of sizes that you need to deal with. As a result, you probably want to have some flexibility in the UI in there, period. Whether or not you take that UI all the way up to the desktop, well, that's another conversation you can have with your team. But in general, anything you put on the web probably needs some level of fluidity and adaptation to account for even one class of devices. I don't think that's avoidable anymore. There's pros and cons to trying to run this across lots of different devices. And I wish I had more time to show that. I'm trying to find a slide that does a nice job articulating it, but I'm not finding it. And I'm down to 0 seconds. That timer makes me nervous. I have to go. No. Actually, our time together is up. The timer did go off. So come up and chat with me. I think we have a lunch right now. If you guys want to ask me questions, I'll be around for a bit. Otherwise, thank you for coming out and appreciate all the questions. Take care.